As Africa marks the continent's day, scholars on the continent have appealed for Africa's history and civilizations not to be forgotten. These include the leading civilizations of the Aksum Empire, the Kingdom of Ghana, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Ethiopian Empire, the Mossi Kingdoms and the Benin Empire, among many that remain rarely spoken about. But it does appear that there is a movement to reclaim Africa's forgotten past, and it's fast gaining momentum. Many Pan-Africanists talk about the role of colonialism in not only destroying a lot of Africa's past physically and culturally, but also in contributing to the contemporary socio-political scene where Africa almost always comes off second best. Archaeologists and historians have in more recent times been uncovering more and more history about pre-colonial Africa and shedding light on how and why these pasts are not always remembered. Well, to hear more about these treasures, we've asked Zimbabwean historian Tendai Pilatwe to join us via Skype, and she joins us all the way from London. Thank you so much for joining us, Tendai. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, so Africa's been called the cradle of mankind and civilization. Let's explore some of that civilization, the early ones particularly. Let's go around the continent and let's start with some of the West African kingdoms, for example.
Okay, so in ancient West Africa, there's three major kingdoms that emerged in the area. The Ghana Empire was the oldest of the three and was the first one to develop long-distance trading, but it was later on absorbed by the Mali Empire. So the Mali Empire, with its large gold and salt trade and large military, was actually a force to be reckoned with through much of West Africa. It had several vassal states, making it the larger one of the three empires. The Songhai Empire, it took its independence from Mali and forged into its own powerful empire. So it was trading in craft goods, gold. It held much influence over the area. So these three empires were really major powers that influenced much of West Africa prior to colonization.
All right, and how sophisticated were they? Do we have any idea?
Yes, they were absolutely sophisticated. They had incredible history of their own. For example, in the southern part of Africa, it was complete with complex societies. They lived by their own sets of rules. So in ancient times, you find that those empires actually brought civilization to humankind.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about then Southern Africa. I know that you and I know Great Zimbabwe quite well, and Mapungubwe is another area. Tell us a little bit about some of the big empires and civilizations in Southern Africa.
Yes, so in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe was founded by the rulers of another ancient kingdom called Mapungubwe, which was probably the first culture in Southern Africa to use a class-based system. So it was one of the first to really use stone architecture. Zimbabwe built upon these traditions, and it developed complex civilizations that focused on mediating trade. So while the northern cities facilitated trade routes between the Mediterranean Sea, the Arabian Seas, Zimbabwe controlled access to the highly desired ivory and gold markets. So you find these products, Zimbabwe was involved in trade networks that stretched into Persia, India, and even China.
All right, so we're traders from very, very early on.
Yes, absolutely. The Great Zimbabwe was the capital city of this kingdom, and it was the largest structure of ancient Southern Africa, actually. So the Zimbabwean structures were built without mortar, which is that substance used to hold uneven stones together. So their stonework had to be extremely precise, indicating their high level of skill. Which, but eventually Zimbabwe was replaced by an even more powerful southern trading center called the Mutapa, and the kingdom was abandoned in the 15th century.
And Great Zimbabwe is still there, just proof again about the workmanship. But let's move to East Africa now and take us through some of the history there.
Okay, in East Africa, the two kingdoms that really prevailed was the Kush and the Aksum. So they were no different. The Kush began as a conduit for trade between the sub-Saharan Africa and the Egyptian empire of the Nile River. So you find Kush's political clout largely rested on the strength of the Egyptians. And only after the fall of the New Kingdom in the 11th century BCE did Kush rise to regional dominance. So Kushite culture flourished for a few centuries before the Assyrian invasion of Egypt. Kush was replaced by various kingdoms of these Aksum. So this is situated further south. Arguably, it rose to its greatest heights from the beginning of the 1st century BCE. So Aksum became a premier economic powerhouse of East Africa, if you like.
All right, so I'm fascinated as well. Often if you're lucky to have traveled across the continent, you hear people speaking their local languages, and one of the things that strikes me often is how similar a lot of these words and language is, even though some of them might even be far apart. And I guess that's all to do with the original Bantu kingdoms.
Absolutely, Peter. So in about 1500 BCE, a group of Bantu language speakers discovered that they could domesticate yams and bananas. So they used their new food to increase their population, and then they spread their knowledge to all of Africa. So this would be the first event in the chain reaction. So more food meant bigger populations, which led to cities. Cities meant trade, which could lead to different foods and iron. So iron would make West Africa part of the trade routes and bring it wealth and power. So the Bantu migrated south of Africa. So we all kind of originate from what is today Cameroon and Nigeria. Bantu languages today include Zulu and Swahili. So about 90 million Africans speak Bantu languages today. What actually happened is they would push off natives of their land or assimilate them into the Bantu way of living.
All right, so what we can say then is when we look at a lot of the sort of Cameroon going across to Kenya, coming down Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, all from the same family, originally from the eastern part of West Africa.
Absolutely. So the Bantu, what archaeologists and historians did was because of the lack of history, due to African history being more of oral rather than written, they studied artifacts, and they found that the actual Bantu languages originated from Cameroon and Nigeria. That's where the people moved. Some of them moved down the western side and to the east as well. So East Africans, Southern Africans are all part of the Bantu family that originated from up in Africa and filled up the whole of what we today call Africa.
So what we're saying is that by and large, it's not far-fetched to say that we are actually of the same DNA and that we're one people.
Absolutely. If we look at history, we'll find that a lot of people look at history, but DNA actually finds the first human being, in fact, the kind to be a black person. They did studies in countries like Ethiopia, where they found that the first man to ever live was from Africa.
Right.
So yes, if we do look at our DNA, we are absolutely from the same continent, from one continent, Mother Africa.
All right, so as a historian on Africa Day, what comes to you, what comes to mind, what should we be thinking about actually as we celebrate Africa Day?
So with Africa Day, to me, it's really, we need to learn our history. I would just wish that schools would be able to embrace that African history in the syllabuses, because you find a lot of history that we learn in school children today. It's Western history about Queen Elizabeth, but we have our own empires, our own civilizations that we are not taught in school. I was just having a conversation with quite a grown man, and they told me they actually discovered the Mapungubwe and the Great Zimbabwe only when they had grown up. So it's our own history is not in our curriculums at school. So this Africa Day, I would urge the education ministries to embrace our civilizations and our history, because it really helps children to know where they've come from, the great civilizations, the empires that existed beforehand. Rather than just learning about the slave trade. We are a really great people, and we have very great civilizations and trade and trades that we've done in the past.
Right. I guess one of the dangers that we have is that a lot of our history is oral history and has been passed down through generations. And if we don't capture all of this and document it properly and keep it safe, some of it will be lost forever.
Yes, in fact, that's the situation that has happened with Africa. A lot of oral history has been destroyed because, it was not documented. A lot of it, we find it from Muslim traders who traveled across the continent during the trades in the ancient times. They wrote some scripts, but then it is also the African culture of a grandparent to sit around with grandchildren and pass on history around, the fireplace. But nowadays, the situation has changed, obviously. That's not happening anymore. So even storytelling time is getting phased out. So as Africans, we need to sort of see if we can document our history. A good source is the UNESCO project that actually took place in 1994, whereby they approached about 231 historians across Africa to document history, having realized that there was not much documentation of African history. Asian history, European history, that's fully documented, but African history is not documented. So what they did was create 8 volumes in a document called the General Africa History. So I would urge anybody interested in African history to look up those volumes, those 8 volumes. They have a wealth of information that they had to literally dig out from surviving historians just in the 80s and in the 90s. So I would urge, if anybody's got any information, especially our elders at the villages, they have a wealth of information, and somehow we need to document that history of our forefathers, lest we will never know what ever existed before.
All right, you know what, I went on to your YouTube channel and I was fascinated by one of the stories where you talk about black people arriving in the Americas long before slavery.
Yes, in fact, we learned at school that Christopher Columbus was the one who discovered America. In fact, any little child will tell you that because it's sang in nursery rhymes. But in his diary, Christopher Columbus himself, he documented that when he reached America, he actually saw that Black people were there first. And it was actually the Black people who discovered the Americas. They obviously, the European history then condemned that, saying Black people were not sophisticated enough to sail ships across the seas. But later it was proven that they did, in fact, sail across the seas way back in about the 1500s BCE, and they in fact got to America, and evidence is there with in countries like Brazil, South America. There are stone features with clearly African faces on them, and you find the same situation in countries like Mexico, whereby the Black people actually painted on the stones the same way that they would do the cave paintings in various African countries. Those paintings are actually found in the Americas. So the debate continues of who discovered the Americas. But Christopher himself wrote it in his own journal.
All right, so, and perhaps to start wrapping up, one of the things that we've done well and have crafted well over time to tell our stories, and perhaps just also as a way of living, is our art. And I just wonder how much of our history that our art tells us.
Yeah, so in terms of art, Africa is very creative. In fact, from our music, our dance, you find that Africans were the first ones. So there's another civilization part that they started. Artists like Picasso in Italy were actually inspired after traveling to Africa with his style of paintings. And also African sculptures. Unfortunately, most of these have now decayed. Some of them are wood, made of terracotta. So they have now been destroyed, but Africans have been very, very much involved in art, creation of masks that they use in different religious ceremonies, dancing. In fact, music originated from Africa, playing of drums. That is very African. In countries like South America, the Latino dance that they do today, samba, it was brought over there by African slaves, and they never got the credit for that. So any dance styles that you find in South America, the Americas, it actually originated in Africa, because Africans have always had a culture of music, dancing, and art as well. But their art was not so much expressional art that we see today. It was connected with spirituality. It was connected with the circumstances that they were facing in that times.
All right, Tendai, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for unearthing some of these amazing treasures that we really need to spend more time and effort in researching, reading and embracing our history. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Stay safe out there in London.
Thank you very much.